Hi everyone, this is Jessica Stencliffe with Accudata Systems, and thank you for joining us for our podcast, an overview of PCI DSS 3.2. We're excited to have two of Accudata's PCI QSAs with us today, Josh Berry and Anton Abaya, who will shed light on the recent PCI update and help you set a game plan for maintaining compliance once those changes take place. So, Anton, we'll have you start by giving our listeners an overview of the PCI DSS 3.2 update.
Thanks, Jessica. So PCI 3.2 is something that a lot of people have been talking about for the past 6 months, I'd say. And two of the main changes that you hear a lot about is the multi-factor requirement for administrative access into a network that has PCI data or your cardholder data environment. This is a new requirement, and there's also the updates to the SSL and TLS deadlines. It used to be that was expected to be in place immediately, but the PCI Council has kind of relaxed on that a little bit and pushed the deadline to June 30, 2018. However, there is one particular deadline that's kind of looming. It's in a few days here. June 30, 2016, for service providers in particular. And the requirement is that they need to have a service offering that can support the secure versions of TLS. That doesn't mean their entire infrastructure needs to have migrated to SSL TLS. That just means they need to have a service offering available to any merchant customers that will be using their service so that they can implement new systems in a secure manner. Or really using the secure versions of TLS. There are a lot of other requirements, but the rest of them don't really have or aren't really expected to be in place until January 31st, 2018. Some of these requirements will affect merchants and service providers, and some will only affect service providers in particular. So I'll walk you through some of those. So there's one particular requirement, in addition to, of course, the multi-factor and the SSL TLS, that affects both merchants and service providers. And that's a new requirement in Section 6 that says change control procedures must include verification that any PCI requirements impacted by the change have not been compromised. That is a deadline of January 31st, 2018. And for service providers only, we have a new requirement in Section 3 that service providers must maintain a documented or a document of its cryptographic architecture as far as PCI or PCI type of data is concerned. There's also a new requirement in Section 10, again for service providers only, that says that they must have in place a mechanism to detect and report on any failures of critical security control systems. Examples of that could be, firewalls failing, IDSs, IPSs, antivirus failing, or say, a firewall access control list being erased somehow, and being able to detect that in a fairly timely manner. Another new requirement, again, for service providers only is in Section 11 that says that service providers must perform penetration testing on any kind of segmentation controls they have every 6 months. That's a very interesting one because, as you may or may not know, the PCI Council updates the PCI DSS whenever there are major breaches that, where they've kind of witnessed or seen or observed control breakdowns, and so they update the PCI standard to kind of to address these types of attacks that they see in the real world. There's also two new requirements in Section 12. The first one is for executive management to be able to spell PCI. But what that really means is that for executive management of service provider companies to establish responsibility for the protection of cardholder data and to have a PCI DSS compliance program in place with oversight from executive management. The other new requirement for service providers in Section 12 is that they need to have processes to perform reviews at least quarterly to confirm that personnel, people within the organization, are following security policies and operational procedures. Right? Again, very important control to have. Now is going to be a requirement in PCI DSS 3.2. The last new addition in 3.2 is actually an appendix. It's called the Designated Entity Supplemental Validation, and it is additional requirements for service providers that have been labeled a designated entity. And what that means is usually these are service providers that may be storing, processing, and or transmitting large volumes of cardholder data, or those providing aggregation points for cardholder data, or those that have suffered significant or repeated breaches of cardholder data. Now, service providers don't self-label themselves as a designated entity. This is usually something that'll come from maybe a card brand or an acquiring bank, maybe even the merchant. So it's not a requirement for service providers to fill out this appendix, but it is not a bad idea, especially if if you already believe you may be or may become a designated entity.
Thank you, Anton, for a great overview of the recent updates. Josh, this next question is for you. From a merchant perspective, what level of investment should they expect, both financially and for time and resources?
Well, as Anton had briefly touched upon, the new requirement for multi-factor authentication for non-console administrative access to the cardholder data environment is probably the most likely new control or change in 3.2 that would come with an associated cost, whether that's monetarily or with time and human resources. And that cost is largely going to be dependent upon how the customer has architected their cardholder data environment. If they have done a good job of isolating and segmenting the cardholder data environment from out-of-scope systems, then multi-factor authentication should be a relatively easy and low-cost control to implement. But for other organizations that have more of a flat network architecture, it's likely to be time-consuming to redesign their environment or to implement it across all of the in-scope system components. Accudata has actually been recommending implementing jump boxes with multi-factor authentication for quite a while as a means to provide effective segmentation into the cardholder data environment. So for some of our customers, quite a few, this will already be kind of a business as usual type of control, but it will definitely be costly for organizations that haven't already adequately architected their CDE to be segmented and isolated within the environment.
Can service providers with the increase in changes on their end expect similar type of investment?
I'm not sure that any of the additional controls for service providers will be particularly costly in terms of time or monetary investment. They're more just tweaks to current business processes or a lot of processes that should probably be in place already, and just minor changes in those processes to enhance security around, such as change control and security awareness training and those kinds of things.
Great, thank you. So in terms of planning time, since most controls aren't taking effect until 2018, how much time should organizations give themselves to ensure compliance prior to the deadline?
I think the first step would be just evaluating how the in-scope, PCI DSS in-scope environment has been architected. As I mentioned before, if adequate segmentation is in place and the company has been compliant with PCI DSS in the past, most of the process changes should be relatively small in terms of implementation time and updates to documentation and whatnot. So those things can be addressed very quickly, but the multi-factor authentication requirement could easily be a 6-month project for an organization that has performed some segmentation of the environment to maybe a year or more for organizations with more of a flat network architecture.
Anton, what are QSAs going to be expecting from customers when they're evaluating whether or not they're implementing controls properly?
So PCI 3.2 has a lot of future dated controls. So if I was to do a 3.2 assessment right now, really the only requirements that I would be most focused on is the SSL TLS related requirements. In particular, because the requirement is that they have a migration plan in place that is documented to achieve compliance with the new SSL TLS, the new secure TLS requirements by the deadline of June 30, 2018. So a migration plan needs to have been developed that will take them there before that deadline. That's the only real thing that I would be looking for. But any good QSA will obviously advise their customers to start performing gap assessments now, looking through these new requirements, especially if you're a service provider, making sure that you've updated your policies, procedures, and processes. Obviously also having a plan for multi-factor authentication deployment across the organization. We wouldn't necessarily review these documents, as part of signing off on an assessment because they're not yet required, and it won't be required until 2018.
So the last thing we'll dive into today is, do you have any best practices or recommendations that you can give our audience in terms of how merchants can initiate a PCI compliance conversation with their service providers if they do have concerns around non-compliance?
The service provider question is definitely, it can be a tricky one depending upon what the service provider is providing. If they are handling cardholder data on behalf of the customer, then we typically advise getting some sort of attestation from them, either being attested to self-assessment questionnaire or report on compliance to confirm that they have security controls in place. If the service provider cannot produce that, then it's definitely a red flag if they're handling cardholder data that the customer should look into, either evaluating other service providers or requesting that, maybe updating contracts that be a requirement. When it comes to other types of service providers, we recommend working closely with a QSA to identify how that provider might affect the security of the environment, so we can address what controls are going to need to be validated. And I always recommend getting in front of that well before your compliance deadline, is trying to perform validation and gather evidence from a third party can be time consuming, and usually it's difficult to communicate what you need to that service provider in a way that they can understand and respond to the requests. So that's the biggest recommendation, is really focusing on those service providers first and having good due diligence processes in place to work with service providers and ensuring that they are meeting the PCI DSS security requirements on behalf of the customer.
Thank you. Great answers, Josh and Anton. We appreciate your time today. That concludes our PCI DSS 3.2 overview. If you have questions, comments, or concerns around how your organization will implement these changes, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. Simply visit www.accudatasystems.com/PCI QSA.